Hello, class. So today we're going to get started on our lecture as well as some updates on the exams. Please note that each section of the exam is going to be clearly explained to you. And I don't want anybody to feel nervous or anxious about the exam. If you're concerned about anything or have any questions, please feel free to message me. So we're going to jump right into today's lecture, and then we're going to do a little bit of a overview of the exam and the course and everything. So before we get started on today's lecture, I just want to make sure we go over. So first things first is this week's pages has been updated to reflect the content that I want you to review in your reading discussion post for this week. So there's a few videos with Dean Spade, Kimberly Crenshaw, some artwork, a video in Democracy Now!, some questions for you to think about. And in addition to that, I want you to focus on a few things for this week. The first thing is that we're in week 3, so we have a lecture that we're going to talk about, which is on structural racism and white privilege. You're also going to identify some key things in our themes for this week, which are trans, feminism, and the race war theory, as we read last week. Then we're going to move towards a discussion post for Friday, June 18th, as well as your midterm exam. So I just want to make sure to remind everybody that the midterm will close this Friday at 11:59. I'm sorry, this Thursday, June 17th at 11:59 p.m. And your discussion post will be due Friday, June 18th at 5 p.m. There's a study guide available here. And again, if you don't recognize the information or you don't see something and it's not familiar, please do not worry. You'll have time throughout the whole exam to review all of your notes, lectures, materials, etc. So the first thing that I wanted you to look through here is we're going to talk about this idea of trans, feminism, and gender and identity politics, in addition to and building off of the early readings and works that we engaged with last week. But for this week, please don't worry about incorporating any of this content into your midterm. The midterm is mostly going to highlight week 1 and week 2. So a preview of the exam is what I like to offer for students that want to review this video before we get into it. You're going to have a few questions. Like I said, this is an open book exam. It's 30% of your grade. There's going to be three identification questions, three short essay questions, and one long essay. They're going to be covering all the course readings and lectures from the first half of the syllabus. So that's week 1 and week 2. There's some stuff that's going to be from week 3, but it's really not going to be like, oh, identify this. Like, please do not worry at all. I think it's mostly going to be covering just major overall themes that we will cover in week 3, but you're not expected to have read all of the readings for this week for this exam. Additionally, you also want to make sure to review the study guide, like I mentioned. The first thing to keep in mind is you want to have concise and informative answers. If you don't know, try your best to look at the notes, but don't just add like filler words or anything because it is open book, so you have all your materials available to you. The definition questions will be considered complete for full points if you provide the author that the term is related to, the definition of the term, and why it's significant to the course, or in general, why you think it's significant. You also want to always make sure you're using complete sentences, checking for grammar mistakes. I won't typically take points off of this, but I mean, just avoid using bullet points. You know the standard. Also, short answer questions will be longer responses, which are going to be about 2 to 3 paragraphs long, and they will require that you refer to the reading. So please make sure to have them available to you. The questions will be very specific to the reading, so make sure that you have read as much of the readings as possible. And you want to make sure that each essay question is also about 4 to 5 paragraphs long. So there's going to be one main essay question, and that's really what you're going to be answering to. I'm sorry, there's going to be 2 essay questions. So I will show you here. You're going to have to define these terms below. Race for theory, theory in the flesh. You're going to have some questions on Kimberly Crenshaw's work, as well as defining gender, sex, and sexuality and what differentiates them. You're going to have to refer back to the Combahee River Collective's reading, as well as Audre Lorde's piece, and identify what are the master's tools. There is an extra credit question, 2 extra credit questions actually. And just please keep note that this is the only essay question that you have, a 40 point essay question. And I'm sorry, there are short and long and longer essay questions. So my apologies for here. It should really only say 1 essay. So I'll make sure to change that for anybody who's confused. But this is going to be the exam. And just note that it will be closing June 17th by 11:59 p.m. So that's at night. And then you will have 5 hours to submit your work once you start the exam. So as soon as you start it, you're going to see this little time running right here that's going to be tracking your time. As you cannot like walk away from, I mean, of course you can take your breaks and all that, but you cannot like go back to it the next day if you don't complete it. There's no save and return or anything like that. It's submitting it once and for all. So have your materials ready. That's why I recommend that. The other thing that you're going to do here is you're going to make sure to complete your reading response for this week, which I've already outlined down below here. It's going to be available June 18th at 5 p.m. You know the drill. You have guidelines. You're responding to the questions and the videos that I outlined. So let's just get right into the course lecture for this week. This presentation lecture is actually curated and created by instructor at Rutgers in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department named Amir Mohammed Aziz. They are a great, amazing instructor who I recommend you review their courses when they're teaching to make sure to sign up for all their classes. This presentation specifically on structural racism and white privilege. And what we're going to be doing is discussing what is race, what is structural racism, because I know we've had different ideas and understandings of this, but I want everybody to just sort of be on the same page. So we're going to do a general overview of what we learned so far and solidify all of these definitions. I want you to also define what is structural racism. We're going to talk about what is whiteness, white privilege, and white fragility. What is anti-Blackness? Why reverse racism is impossible in the United States. How to rethink racism and different structures and theories. Different theories for structural racism. We're going to talk about the difference between individual versus structural racism and intention versus impact. We're also going to engage with Ruth Wilson's Gilmore's definition of racism and provide an overall recap of everything at the end. So, what is race? Contrary to the mainstream conception that race is biological, race is also instead a social construct designed to classify groups of people based upon human perception of social differences, such as skin, color, physical features, and geographical origin. Saying race is a social construct does not make its effects any less real. While race may be socially constructed, utilized by people and societies to make sense of their cultures and identities, people still do experience the real social effects of race, which manifests as racism and racist discriminations. So keep this in mind that you're also going to be thinking through race, not just in terms as an individual experience or something that you witness on an individual interpersonal level, but also that is socially constructed and that has severe impacts for everyone and in different ways for a lot of us. Structural racism is a widespread system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. It identifies dimensions of US history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with so-called whiteness and disadvantages associated with so-called color, people of color, to endure and adapt over time. Racism is not something limited to a few individuals or something that institutions can choose to practice. Instead, it has been a common feature of all social, economic, and political systems in the United States, given how the US was deeply founded. My apologies for this sound. I live in a busy street. I want to repeat and emphasize this very clearly. In the United States, the US was deeply founded upon the enslavement of the African people, the genocide of Native Americans, and the notion of white European supremacy over all other race and ethnicities. There is not just one type of racism, but many forms of racisms, and all of them are structural, yet not all are always available and clear for us to see. So this diagram here is a triangle that shows like an iceberg or pyramid that states at the top, readily observable, and at the bottom, there's a line underneath the water line that states difficult to observe. In this iceberg, in the difficult to observe area, there are particular forms of racism, and in the easily or readily observable area, there are overt or explicit ways of seeing racism. So at the top, some of the explicit ways of seeing racism and examples that you can think about and discuss in your discussion posts are hate crimes and poor treatment. These are very overt examples of racism, right? And oftentimes, even in these very overt examples, we see that the state usually fails to respond in any uplifting or transformative way. In the difficult section underneath the waterline are covert or symbolic forms of racism that are difficult to see or witness. This includes implicit attitudes towards a particular community group. It also refers to structural systems like segregation or racist ideology or institutional policies. For example, systems of housing like Section 8 housing that are inherently determined and made to further gentrify communities and keep certain people oppressed, particularly Black and Indigenous people of color. So covert, symbolic, and structural forms of racism are often more difficult to analyze. But as we'll see in this class, I'm sorry, not to analyze, to observe, as you will learn in this class, all of these forms can be understood through a different analysis of engaging with racism, gender, and sex. As we'll see, these are constantly working together and it influence how certain racisms are explicitly observable or difficult to observe. Examples of racisms include pre-colonial understandings of um, pre-colonial efforts of othering people, particularly Black Indigenous people, viewing them as needing to be saved, or missionary efforts working to save people and provide usually evangelical or Judeo-Christian practices based on ideals of whiteness, oftentimes, which is distinct from the way that Black, Indigenous, and people of color experience religion and practice Christianity and other forms of religion. This is specifically referring to colonial efforts to really annihilate Indigenous and Black practices altogether. Racism is also related specifically to religious faith and practice in ways that this shows here in this image that says it's actually a organizer that's fighting towards the building of more mosques. This idea of the model minority, that an immigrant should be upstanding, excellent, have explicit experience in code switching and moving in between different forms of whiteness and non-whiteness. These are all aspects of the model minority. Also thinking through racism as a constant, ever changing aspect of society that influences everything. Treaties like happening in different parts of the US, resettlement, the very aspect of land ownership and property. We see rebuilding efforts happening in Hawaii and other parts of the world, in the South Texas border. We see a lot of new efforts to continue to build more military drones and aspects of surveillance at the border and in those neighboring communities. And we see a constant history repeat itself in terms of the incredible and horrific violence that happens due to policing and the murder that so many police engage in. In the summer, we saw the killing of George Floyd and the incredible organizing efforts that were created in response to that. We came into a year anniversary with the aftermath of the trial to think about ways how these are all continuing practices of racism, not at an individual level, but at a structural level, that it is always structural, even if it's not explicitly available for us to see it that way. Structural racism is really related to this formula. It's a combination of both prejudice and structural powers to oppress. It is always structural, meaning that regardless of whether we say racism or structural racism, and we differentiate between the two, it is always structural. Racism is often incorrectly understood as an individual thing, meaning that it's understood as something that someone experiences, or someone is racist or not racist. But the truth is that we all benefit from anti-Blackness in the world, and that racism is not merely a personal attitude. It is actually a racialized structure of power. In the US specifically, an individual can be perpetuating racism and white privilege without even being conscious of it. This is precisely because racism does not need its beneficiaries to even become conscious or intentional about their privilege in order to function. This is really important here. I think it's really important to emphasize that racism does not need its beneficiaries to even be conscious or intentional about their privilege in order to function. At the individual level, racism is defined as a person's belief and actions that serve to perpetuate oppression. This is conscious and unconscious. Another way to think a bit about it is also on thought. A lot of times you may respond or engage in a certain way where you don't think about it. It's inherently tied to the way that you exist in the structure you've been raised in, grown up in, etc. It is also both externalized and internalized. It is an act that can happen to someone else in public outside, but it's also something that's happening internally at the same time. This is why internalized racism is incredibly important here, thinking about the way that we internalize anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous ideologies into our system to refute and hate those parts of our either ancestry, our communities, our neighbors, etc. At the systemic or structural level is the institutional policies and practices that organize or so-called sector the levels that perpetuate oppression. It is also structural in the sense that these effects interact and accumulate across institutions. So policing and immigration go hand in hand. Land and environmental justice go hand in hand. All of these things and systems work simultaneously. And this is why a lot of organizers are forced to work in interdisciplinary ways to adapt to the ever expanding collaboration happening between racist systems across the world. The biggest example that I can think of is mostly related to the work I do, which shows that both the immigration system and the US criminalization system work together hand in hand, the same way that police and immigration and customs officials work together as well. At the level or in between of both this diagram, and this diagram is two circles. The left is the individual circle, the right is the institutional circle, and at the middle they're met with the interpersonal, the everyday, which are the interactions between people, both within and across difference. When we talk about whiteness, there's an author by the name of Neil Irvin Painter who writes on the history of white people. This doctor writes how whiteness is a social contract like race, and she's great at defining specifically whiteness and how this relates to this construction of race. Whiteness and white people in the US make up a socially constructed racial group with their own privileges. And it is thus the invisibility of whiteness where people are socialized into unseeing whiteness, as whiteness is seen as the automatic universal standard of humanity. One of the greatest examples or easiest examples of this is to think about the way that woman and man are identified. Both of these categories exist independently alone and represent white people. But if you think about the way that man and woman is defined in terms of a person of color, you see that there has to be an additive word to reflect someone non-white, which means that the mainstream or the general normative hegemonic example is whiteness. As you'll see with the way that ethnicity or racial categories are attached to people of color and their gender, as a Latinx man, Indigenous man, Black woman, Black child, etc. All of these additive words to distinguish what is non-white. And this is how whiteness becomes invisibilized. One of the ways that you worked on this is to scan news coverage and social media, TV shows, films, sci-fi media, etc. And you kind of notice, and I want you to think about this throughout the semester, is notice how figures, names, and characters who are white are often depicted and described by their individual attributes with no need to mention their whiteness. In particular, look at depictions in cartoons, anime, comics, films, etc., where representations of whiteness predominate but rarely are acknowledged. James Powell in Racing to Justice states, American identity is defined as white, and whiteness is used to examine without being examined. The invisibility of whiteness in a white-dominated culture is similar to the invisible presence of the narrator in a story told from the third-person point of view. The ever-present subject, i.e. the author, has the power to name and define the object without ever calling explicit attention to his or her presence or perspectives. This perspective then becomes the unexamined framework by which objects are described and defined. The invisibility of the related white gaze, as well as of whiteness itself, enables whites to simultaneously recognize that non-whites have been denied opportunities and resources, and yet to assert that whites have achieved their own societal status through personal merit. Very important quote here that I want you to think about for your response post, specifically in relation to where the idea of whiteness comes from and why it was even created. In 1691, Virginia House of the Bourgeoisie Law included a first documented use in English of speaking colonies of the word white, rather than European or Christian, to legally limit citizenship to white men who were single or married to white women. Additionally, to exclusively endow land-owning, voting citizenship rights, and other forms of power to whites only, and particularly white men, the 1790 Naturalization Act was established to create alliances in multi-class communities among white populations. Whiteness, in other words, white communities and the European or Christian communities who had power at that time, created a racial and gender category created to exclude both white women and people of color from access to property and citizenship. So this is really the part that I want to emphasize here. It was thus a racial gendered category created to exclude both white women and people of color from access to property and citizenship. Whiteness was created in contrast to blackness, an idea invented to justify the stealing and brutal enslavement of Africans and to justify the freedom of Europeans in the colonies. To eliminate the possibility of multiracial alliances and uprisings, those of African descent were stripped of any rights that they previously held as indentured servants. And this was specifically part of the 1676 Bacon Rebellion and the 1705 Virginia Slave Codes. White privilege then is depicted in many different ways. For example, I can take a job with an affirmative action employer without having my coworkers on the job suspect that I got it because of my race, end quote. I am never asked to speak for all the people of my racial group, end quote. I can worry about racism without being seen as self-interested or self-seeking. I will feel welcomed and normal in the usual walks of public life, institutional and social. I do not have to educate my children to be aware of systemic racism for their own daily physical protection. If I have low credibility as a leader, I can be sure that my race is not the problem. If my day, week, or year is going badly, I need not ask of each negative episode or situation whether it had racial overtones. These are all different examples of white privilege. James Baldwin states, white people are, in effect, still trapped in a history which they do not understand, and until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. They have had to believe for many years and for innumerable reasons that Black men are inferior to white men. Many of them indeed know better, but as you will discover, people find it very difficult to act on what they know. To act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. In this case, the danger, in the minds of most white Americans, is the loss of their identity. And this is by James Baldwin and his famous piece, The Fire Next Time. White fragility is really what James Baldwin was getting at here, this fear of identity, of loss of identity. Robin DiAngelo's piece in White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, was published in 2018. And she defines white fragility as the perception that any attempt to connect white people to the system of racism is unsettling and morally unfair, and where the smallest amount of racial stress, calling out one's whiteness, is intolerable. White fragility is a defensive reaction where the individual denies that they benefit from white privilege. White fragility triggers emotional responses such as anger, fear, guilt, silence, blame, and withdrawal. The denial of white privilege does not erase white privilege, but demonstrates how it precisely exists. White fragility is a structure. It is a collectively learned response that upholds racial dominance and the protection of white privilege. White fragility also serves to reinstate white racial comfort. In other words, the comfort of not having to question your privilege, and dominance, the idea that if whiteness doesn't exist, then nothing needs to be done. A person with white privilege may be a minority in other aspects, class, gender, sexuality, etc., but the existence of these intersectional identities does not erase the fact of white privilege. I showed here several different examples that we talked a little bit about already. Overt forms of white supremacy are lynchings, hate crimes, swastikas, the use of the N-word, racial slurs, racist jokes, neo-Nazis, burning crosses. Covert white supremacy, which is considered socially acceptable, includes Make America Great Again hats. I'm sorry, this slogan of a campaign of Make America Great, hiring discrimination, police murdering people of color, racial profiling, paternalism, police brutality, mass incarceration, Eurocentric curriculum, in other words, focusing on European or white scholars, English only initiatives, expecting people of color to teach white people, blaming the victim, tokenism, color blindness, claiming reverse racism, cultural appropriation, not challenging racist jokes, this quote unquote response of don't blame me, I never owned slaves, the celebration of Columbus Day, self-appointed white allies, assuming that good intentions are enough, a school to prison pipeline, not believing the experiences of people of color, virtuous victim narrative, denial of white privilege, denial of racism. These are many, many different examples where you can see this show up on a daily basis. Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, in her piece titled Radical Dharma, Talking Race, Love, and Liberation, states in her essay, in her piece, states the tiptoeing around race and other forms of difference as if in fear of waking a sleeping lion is one of the most subtly toxic attributes of whiteness in our culture right now. Everyone fears making mistakes. In Tears We Cannot Stop, A Sermon to White America, Reverend Michael Eric Dyson talks about so much has been invested in whiteness that it is hard to let it go. It is often defensive, resentful, full of denial and amnesia. The only way to save our nation, and yes, to save yourselves, is to let go of whiteness and the vision of American history it supports. I'm not asking you to let go of your humanity, but in the best way possible to find your way back to it. What is anti-Blackness? Whiteness does not exist without Blackness. And in anti-Black ideology, the principle or the leading goal is white supremacy and privilege. Black people and people of African descent are cast as racial others. White supremacy is predicated on the racist idea of Black inferiority, where Black people are cast as inferior, childlike, dangerous, and irrational. Other non-Black racial ethnic groups may participate in anti-Blackness and white supremacy by denigrating Blackness, as doing so may offer them access to and proximity to whiteness and white privilege. And it's very important to note that this can happen to all of us at all moments in time, and that we all benefit from anti-Blackness in some way. And that to ask you to think and reflect on your experiences and your actions does not mean that you're a bad person, that you're not worthy of um, community and respect and love, but that it's important for you to reflect on these things so we can all create a better world together. And this is an important process that we all should do constantly on a daily basis, because often, as we learned in earlier parts of this series or this segment, is that a lot of times the work that we do and how we respond to things is not, even with the best intentions, may not always benefit and support all communities in the same way. Reverse racism, I'm sure many of you have heard, is impossible in the US. And the reason we're going to say this is because if you don't know what reverse racism is, it's the idea or the concept or the framework that you can experience racism as someone who is white or who benefits from racial privilege, or that if someone is attacking you or asking you to reflect on some type of experience, your assumption is that you're being attacked, that someone is attacking you, that someone is not giving you the support that you need to be able to understand what happened or what's going on. And I think that this is really important for us to keep in mind, because a lot of times we're going to hear this idea of reverse racism, but it's really not possible, because you have to keep in mind that racial and ethnic groups who experience racism and are targeted, such as African Americans, Black people, Latinx people, Indigenous First Nation people, by this definition specifically, cannot practice racism. They may express prejudice, negative attitudes about another's person, ethnicity, race, but not racism, as racism is a structure that requires racial and ethnic minorities to possess institutional power, which they do not historically possess. So this is really important here, because a lot of times when we're talking about anti-Blackness or we're talking about anti-Indigenous or indigeneity, some of the responses that people will have is actually, well, what about violence within Black communities? Or what about the way that Indigenous communities are violent towards each other? And yes, this is definitely a thing that is constantly happening at all moments. But it's very important to note that it's not racism, it is discrimination, it can be negative attitude, it can have um, negative connotations and treatment. But racism is specifically when a particular person benefits that person, that individual. It is a structure that requires that person to possess institutional power. And typically, these groups do not have that power. So it's a different type of discrimination, negative attribute that is not necessarily related to racism. And I think that this is really, really important to distinguish. And I encourage you to talk about this in your response. A lot of times we'll talk about anti-Blackness within other communities of color and the way that that shows up, and that's different, because in those communities that at anti-Black racism, those structures do benefit from anti-Blackness. So this is really specifically a specific addressing all just racism generally. When we're talking about racism generally, if you're not being specific about the connotation of the group that is experiencing, it might not necessarily be helpful to use racism and to think about discrimination as an alternative that speaks to the negative attitudes that one person may have towards someone within even their own racial group, but that this is not racism because that person is not benefiting from a structural system. When anti-Blackness shows up, for example, in non-Black Latinx communities, that is racism because non-Black Latinx communities benefit from anti-Black structures in all ways. So please keep this in mind that these terms are helpful, but they're also meant to really define specific things. Racism, discrimination, prejudice, they're not the same. Anti-Black racism and racism are not the same. So please make sure to keep note of that. If you have questions, please discuss it in your response post or feel free to reach out to me. The key thing here is that anyone can really hold racial prejudice, but not everybody has the structural power to oppress. In other words, to really hurt and engage in racial harm. So reverse racism is impossible in the United States because racism is always a structure and racism will function regardless of the good intentions of individual people. We're not saying that people's good intentions don't matter. Of course they matter, but rather than good intentions alone, we have to think about the ways that dismantling racism requires an entire structural approach, a broad structural approach. And this is particularly why movements such as Black Lives Matter and Say Her Name target racist structures in their campaigns by drawing attention specifically to how racism is deeply embedded in all structures and levels of US society, such as housing policies, access to education, and employment and policing practices. Unlearning or our existing definitions of racism is very important. Some of you right now may have doubts and maybe questioning this new perspective or definition of racism, and you might be saying things like, racism is clearly an individual attitude. I've seen it, I've witnessed it. What do you mean it's a structure? You're also maybe thinking, someone from a racial or ethnic group the other day treated me horribly. This is clearly racism. I felt like I was treated unfairly based on my race. No, that's not, that's something that you may be thinking too, but it's okay because we're going to talk a lot about why all these things are coming up and why you might be confused and saying, no, I'm not sure, I'm confused, what's going on here? Another thing you might be thinking is that hateful acts towards any person based on their race or ethnicity is clearly racism. So how can it be otherwise? And these questions are all super important. And a good practice is to always listen and prioritize the experiences of those who actually experience racism. And when you do that, you're creating a space to allow people to not just have to educate you specifically about why you benefit from anti-Blackness or etc., but to specifically give you an understanding from their personal experiences that may help you to understand others' experiences that you might not yourself experience on a direct basis. So in order to rethink racism, we have to distinguish between individual versus structure, which is what we've been talking about already. We also have to distinguish the difference between intention versus impact. Rethinking racism means that individual versus structure, that racism is about structure. It is all right to talk about individual acts of racism, but always try to link it to broader structures of power. Rather than saying, why did you do this and why did this happen? Ask yourselves, what structures of society enabled this to happen? This is really, really important here. What structures of society enabled this to happen? And also think about the intention versus impact. Racism is about impact on collective groups, not about individual good intentions and wishes. Individual intentions and declarations that one isn't racist often do little to dismantle the structures of racism. So I want to emphasize that again. Individual intentions and declarations that one isn't racist often do little to dismantle the structure of racism. Racism is not an event, it is a constant process, as stated by Zinzi Mandela from NPR in a statement at a press release in April of 2004. Individual versus structure means that racism is a structure, not an individual act. First of all, be willing to confront and acknowledge questions that you may have about your existing definitions of racism. We all learn and absorb ideas about race and ethnicity all the time from everywhere, from people around us, from our parents, from friends, family, media, school, etc. And many of us have been socially conditioned to think about racism as an individual act perpetuated by an individual evil person, and that racism is a rare occurrence in an otherwise racially harmonious world. But the reality is that this framework of how we've been conditioned to think is actually really, unfortunately, a distortion of how racism actually works. Racism in the US against people of color, specifically against Black people, is structural and historical and an everyday occurrence, often invisibilized from the public eye. It is not limited to individual acts and intentions. And I want to emphasize that that doesn't mean that it doesn't include individual acts and intentions, but that it is not limited by those. It is also important to clarify that thinking of racism as an individual act is not wrong. That we're not saying that there are no individual acts of racism. Of course, there are. That is, racist acts from the dominant racial group in power against racial ethnic minorities. Rather, if we exclusively think of racism as an individual act or about individual intentions, this severely limits and distorts our perspective on how racism, a widespread structure, actually works in the US. So there's a brief video that
Moving the race conversation forward. You've probably noticed that when our news media talks about race, when they talk about racism, when they talk about racial justice issues, they quite often talk
justice. When we're talking about racism in terms of a structure and not the individual, Robin DiAngelo states, when a racial group's collective prejudice is backed by the power of legal authority and institutional control, it is transformed into racism, a far-reaching system that functions independently from the intentions or self-images of individual actors. This authority transforms individual prejudices into a far-reaching system that no longer depends on the good intentions of individual actors. It becomes the default of the society and it is reproduced automatically. Racism is a system. So you may be thinking, which groups are affected by race and structural racism? Although groups have significantly different experience in the United States, Black people, Latinx people, sorry for the misspell, Asian and Pacific Island people, Indigenous or Native people, and multiracial or multi-ethnic people all are viewed as being non-white and have at some point experienced subordination, excluded, or been marginalized at some time or another by institutional practices, popular beliefs, and habits that implicitly or explicitly support white privilege. And this is important to note because as we are moving towards this conversation of the intention versus impact, racism as impact, not intention, means that racism is not about the rare, evil, or hateful individual. Racism is ordinary, common, and everyday, meaning that it benefits many ordinary people and that we all benefit from it while discriminating others. Racism is perpetuated and maintained by institutions, policies, politics, and particularly those who are in power. Racism is not merely between individuals, but that it also occurs across levels of society, and that it's also translated into policy and politics that also shapes the way that minorities experience access to employment, affordable healthcare, safe housing, quality education, and the freedom of mobility. Racism also does not come solely from an individual's bad intention and bad intention alone. It's specifically related to something that's collectively learned. It is collectively taught and it is collectively transmitted. It also does not emerge from some individual evil, but it's a collective structural phenomenon. And racism occurs because there are structures of society that embolden those in power to institute discriminatory policies while encouraging many ordinary people to benefit from and deny racism's structural existence. Racism cannot be dismantled with good intentions. Good intentions are a start, but that is nowhere near the end. Your good intentions are really only as effective as of dismantling structural racism if they're accompanied with concrete actions. And this means that we got to question what racism even looks like. And we saw that a little bit in our conversation with the iceberg, but racism is specifically police brutality against Black people. It is the greater level of housing, school, and job discrimination that people of color encounter on a daily basis. It is also the policy of locking migrants into cages and separating children from their parents. And it is also the automatic profiling of Black and Latinx and Indigenous youth as criminals. Racism is the denial that there is racism. And it is also maintained by the belief that racism can be instantly solved just by one's good intentions and increasing one's awareness, which is not at all accurate. Racism is also linked to the histories of European colonization and of the world. And it is specifically about the process that racism does to dehumanize non-Europeans as being inferior, criminal, unintelligent, and uncivilized. Another video that I want you to see is really talking about the difference between intention versus impact. Please feel free to review in your response. It's not going to be, the audio is not going to be able to be heard as I record the lecture, so please make sure.
What's up, everybody? I'm Dr. CI, and this is episode 8 of our 2018 learning series.
Robin DiAngelo states, I can focus on my impact and let go of my intent. Right now, most white people believe that if our intentions are good, then the impact of our behavior should not count. And I'm sure you've seen that kind of defensive response too. You know, insistence that I did not mean to do that, therefore, get over it, as opposed to what would be much more constructive in terms of repairing the breach. I did not mean to do that, and I would never have wanted to do that, but I see that I have indeed done that, and for that I apologize. Where can we go from here? Intention versus impact is, for example, prevalent in the type of propaganda that was seen in the type of early 60s and 50s and 60s social justice organizing movements that led to a lot of Chicano, Black, Indigenous groups building support organizations, the Young Lords, the Black Panthers, and many different examples within contemporary practices. I can think about critical resistance, different coalitions built across the nation to shut down prisons and ICE facilities. This here is a slogan that says, we serve whites only, no Spanish or Mexicans. On the other side, there is a young person in the back is a pink backdrop with a speech bubble coming out of their mouth saying, I don't see race, I'm a good person. Their skin is white or pale, and it states at the bottom, translation, I'm going to use my place of privilege to refute and deny the sufferings of those who do not have white privilege, while at the same time erasing their personal and cultural history. Intention versus impact is really important because we're going to apply it to what we've learned. So I want you to think about this. Quote, but I haven't done anything racist. How can I be racist then? Some of the answers that you may want to respond to somebody who might say that is, because racism is a structure, it does not need your consent to function. You do not need to have done or said anything to benefit from racism, colorism, and white privilege. Racism works as a collective machine, and you benefit from it regardless of what you do, say, unless that entire system of racism is dismantled. Another example that you might hear is, so does being white automatically make me racist? I didn't choose my race or ethnicity. And your potential answer could be, no, we're not saying you're inherently racist. Remember, don't think of racism in terms of individuality. Am I a racist? Am I not a racist? Decenter yourself by prioritizing those who experience racism, and don't make this all about your goodness. This is not the issue here. Challenging racism will make people uncomfortable. This is part of the painful process of unlearning and dismantling racisms and their structure. You might also hear, isn't saying all white people are racist make you a racist? This idea of reverse racism. And the possible answer is no. Racism, by definition, is a group's collective structural power to oppress over minorities who do not possess that same collective power. Reverse racism does not and cannot exist in the current context of the US. What is racist is not your whiteness. What is racist is the refusal to acknowledge that white privilege and white supremacy exist. There's a cartoon here by Natalie Nouragat who says, there's two people speaking and one of them says, I'm not racist. And the other says, and then they say, but, and the person puts the hand over their mouth and says, shh. And in the second panel, the person with the hand over the mouth of the other is just holding them and continuing to say, shh. And then they say in the speech bubble, nothing good comes after that. Ruth Wilson's Gilmore definition of racism is, racism specifically is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. In other words, it is the process, the ideologies, the systems that create white life and promote white life and stop or diminish non-white life. Impacts of vicarious racism on child health are that approximately 48% of child outcomes reviewed stated that racism was negatively associated with physical health, care, and utilization, weight, general illnesses, frequency of sick visits. It is also related to social-emotional health, behavioral problems, and self-esteem, and it is also really tied to mental health and child development, depression, anxiety, and cognitive development. Racism's structural impact is really reflected in minorities such as Black and Latinx communities and are more likely to experience vulnerabilities because of these life chances, physical health, and access to the basic necessities of life. Some of the main ways to rethink racism, as we've discussed, is to move away from the individual versus structural approach. Racism is specifically about structure. It is all right to talk about individual acts of racism, but always try to link it to a broader structure of power. Rather than saying, why did so and so do it, ask yourself, what structures of society enabled this to happen? The other thing, and just to review, is that intention and impact are very different. Racism is about impact on collective groups, not about individual good intentions and wishes. Individual intentions and declarations that one isn't racist often do little to dismantle the structures of racism. Which came first, race or racism? Ta-Nehisi Coates in Between the World and Me states, race is the child of racism, not the father, and has never been a matter of genealogy and physiognomy so much as one of hierarchy. So now that we've gone over this whole entire presentation, I want you to really think about what is it that you want to talk about in your response post in addition to the questions. Ask me anything that you might need clarification on. If this is your first time engaging with concepts like this or learning about this, please feel free to say what's coming up for you, what you need more support with. Make sure that you're respectful of other students' ideas and experiences. Please do not share anything that may be harmful to another student. Sometimes we may want to reflect on experience or time where we were racist or saw or witnessed a racist act, and this may be harmful for other students to read who may be part of those communities. So please be cognizant of all that. If you have any questions about your exam, your responses, I look forward to receiving them, and thank you so much.